Alright, so the camera is rolling.
And we do have a lot of outside noises.
Oh, let me close this one.
Yeah.
It's okay. The noise should be okay. That microphone is super directional, so
Oh, good.
I should be in a good
There's
spot.
usually this guy that drives down the middle of the road and he lets his dog like, oh, he goes real slow. Just like, oh my gosh. I think he does that for the tourists just to make them crazy.
Is there like an obvious sort of tension between sort of tourists and locals?
I think it depends on what town that you live in. In this town, it used to be a timber town. Like this whole county in Oregon was populated through and built through the timber life. And since that's gone, or almost completely gone, it's not making any funds. Oh.
Do you want that lettering green instead of blue?
Yeah.
Can I tie in with your
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
So Joseph had to understand how to thrive. So everybody in Joseph's all in, and they want the tourism and all of that. They're very excited about it. Enterprise, for the most part, feels the same way. You get further down in the beginning of the valley, and they're like, we're not Joseph, we don't want no stinking tourists here. And then other people in that little town are like, we need them to keep going. And so, yeah. So that's why my museum's right here in the center, because I get, pre-COVID 1,200 visitors during the summer and shoulder season from all over the world. Yeah, it's hard for some to adapt. The old timers, ranchers and farmers, I think there's a different look and feel for that. They're losing a lot of things. Controversy around the wolves being introduced to the area.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm.
You mean like being introduced back, or was there a wolf population before?
I don't know that there were before. I think there was a kind of wolf, but they introduced a different wolf that wasn't.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that wasn't native to the area, and they range huge. I mean, there were wolves that started here that have been spotted in California at this point, and they're just killing, the livestock. They're killing whatever they can. They hate dogs. They'll kill them. Yeah.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let me take a quick sip. You're gonna hear it gurgling. Okay, am I square?
Oh yeah, you're good. Yeah, everything's great.
Yeah, just for starters, the center is first started in 2008, correct?
Yeah, our organization started in 2008. Yes.
So when did the actual building and the actual center come into play?
We had our first museum space in 2010 in Enterprise. And we were thinking we ought to have it in Wallowa, the town of Wallowa, because that's closest to the area. And at the time, we just weren't able to get that connection with the community to make that happen. So we did it in Enterprise. And after that year, their brand new mayor called and said, my first duty is to get your museum down here in Wallowa. And they provided a space for us. The heat was provided by the bank. We had lots of in-kind donations that we could move and get started down there. And so we were there right next to the Nez Perce Interpretive Center. And when they weren't open, we'd open for them and vice versa. So it was really a collective connection. However, we didn't get very many visitors in that space. And over a few, actually probably a couple of years, we realized that it wasn't a good fit. And there was just, it was a different energy that was going on. And again, having to train people to come to a town that's not used to people stopping is an undertaking that would take years and years. And so we reached out to someone that we knew in Joseph, and we were just down the street about 2 blocks away. And we were upstairs in a small space. And it was great. We were in Joseph. There was more traffic. However, this work attracts many elders. They couldn't get up the stairs. They would say, "We really are so glad that you're here, but we just can't make it up the steps, but we're proud of you." So when I read in the paper that this space became available, I called immediately and got us into this space right away. So we've been here since 2015.
And I was reading just that, you know, a big inspiration for the whole project in general was just learning about your father, Lucky, and his stories. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Can you reiterate, can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So I was just reading that, you know, a big inspiration for the whole Maxville Heritage Project was learning about your father, Lucky, and sort of his stories from logging.
Right. In 2003 was the first time I had heard that my dad was a logger. I'd not heard that story before. And I'm one of 7 kids that he had. And I was, you know, I heard it from someone I didn't know very well, and they said, you know, you ought to go up to that place, a nearby town called Promise, where they have this annual gathering of homesteaders. They're like, your people are from up there. You need to go find out. And that just blew my mind. I mean, I had to rethink because everyone in my family did janitor work. From my grandmother to my mom and aunts, my uncles. We grew up doing that as kids. So I figured we were brought there to do the cleaning, you know? I didn't get it because there were no black kids in any classroom that I was in. So when I heard about it, I was fascinated. I was beyond fascinated. I was already in school, had been laid off from Boeing after 9/11, and they were putting me through school, and so I chose to go into video production and graphic design because they were close to the work that I'd been doing, the type of work. And so I asked the school, can I take this equipment up to Oregon? And they're like, yeah, go for it. And so I came loaded down with equipment and questions, and really the first time I went up there, up to the Promise reunion. Now, keep in mind, my dad was born in 1904. So he was 56, 57 when I was born. And so I went there, and of course I'm the only black face in the crowd in the middle of nowhere again. I'm recognizing some of the faces of the kids that we'd gone to school with, of course, older faces. But when they introduced me, and they left me to last because they knew I was coming, and they had a little plan in for me too, is they said, well, we have one more person to introduce to you, and everybody knew who it was. There were 200 and some people sitting outside on their benches, and a lot of them were elder, and as I walked past them all, I could hear them whispering, you know, to each other, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be fun. And so I stood up and I said, I'm Gwen Trice, and I represent Lafayette Lucky Trice of Maxville. And that's how it began that whole day. The day afterward, for hours upon hours, those elders, as soon as I said that, then they started talking loudly. Well, now I know him, and I remember him, and he sold me my first rifle. It's over in the truck over there. And just the stories of this gentleman that he was Charlie Trump, and he was about 89, sitting on the porch in his rocker, and he says, "Yep, I remember when your dad came over to the Grange Hall, and he came with his wife." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" Because he didn't meet my mom until much later, and so I didn't know he had been married before. And he said, "Yep, I remember playing the fiddle, and boy, your dad sure could dance." And I just had this visual of my dad dancing to fiddle music in the Grange Hall with his wife, coming from the camp down the road. And they began to fill my head with all of these stories of who he was as a young man, which I didn't know. I had no idea. And as little kids, you don't ask those things. I think the only thing I ever asked him was I saw a scar on his back. I used to hide in my parents' bedroom to read books. I'd lay across their bed, and he came in the bedroom one day, and I was reading a book, and he came in to change clothes to do one of his meetings, and he had this huge scar along his back, and I went, "Wow, what happened?" "Oh, that was a logging accident." And he said, I had it was wired back together. And all I could think of was, getting a hanger and then wiring it back together. I'm a little kid. I don't know what that means, but I just thought it was horribly scarred, and it must have been so painful. And that's the only time, because he never did say, well, I was a logger. Now, as I started asking questions of other people and started realizing his influence in the space, I began to realize that he gained a lot of respect by who he was in the logging world here, but he grew up in a logging camp in the South, which I didn't know. So he grew up with his mom and dad and sisters and brothers outside of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And so this had been part of his life, his whole life, although he also did mechanical work. And so his dad was a mechanic, so he taught him how to do that work. So at Maxville, he ran the crosscut saw, but he also helped to work on the engines with his father, and then his father also helped with the field horses. He had 17 of them there to help haul the logs. And so I began to realize how intricate his life was woven into the land. Really, he was a hunter-gatherer as well. We were all raised on elk and deer and wild birds and fish. He was on the Marine Board. He was on the boxing commission. And so he was a lightweight boxer. He wasn't a tall man, but if you use the N-word, he would just knock you out. And then that'd be the end of it. And that was sort of his signature. He just didn't play. But he was also this generous conservationist, taught us how to love community no matter what you look like. No matter who you were, he helped the eldest to the youngest. And that's who I knew. But then to hear how he was as a young man is just been, I just want to weep right now. It's so overwhelming to meet him again in this way.
How proud of you? I'm just hearing you. It just seems like you just have tremendous pride.
So, yeah. I embody him in what I do with my work today. I was never going to come back home. When I left, when the teachers tell you, when I was going to school, that you can only be janitor services or you can only be a nurse, don't strive to be more than that. I never took that bait. I never believed it, and it created energy in my family because I watched in, as we all do, we watch the people around us to figure out who we are in the world. I mean, of course, I'm one of those people that was definitely, into Mary Tyler Moore, so it was like, what would Mary do, I was that person, but I was also, I needed to have some muscle tone. I had 5 brothers and a very popular sister, and that became a nurse. And I wanted to do everything else but that. And I needed to know how to get there. And I just watched how my dad navigated different things, and he was a sensitive human being, and he'd get pretty mad, but he was sensitive. And if he got his feelings hurt, he would cry. He'd come home and he'd play the piano. And he'd say, I'd never hate anybody but 2 people. And one of them was a judge, and one was somebody else that he got flack from because he was black, of course. And even before my birth, there was a cross burned in our yard in LeGrand. So he stood, and I don't know if he was fearful inside, but he didn't show it to us. He showed us how to be brave and how to be a part of, and he was actively involved in my brother's sports. He was the lineman when they were playing football. He was all of these things. Even as an older person, he never stopped doing everything until, he lost his eyesight and his body started deteriorating, but he still always fished. He would have the younger men that he taught to fish come and pick him up, and he'd have his poles already lined up, and he had his oxygen tank ready, and he'd have all his equipment ready, and he'd just wait by the door for him to come get him so he can go fishing. And he was on the Marine Board. He was head of the Steelheaders and Sportsmen Fishermen Association. He led a huge group at the Looking Glass Fish Hatchery to make sure that the fingerling salmon native to this area were always going to be there. He really cared about the land and the people. And he wouldn't fight just locally. He would go to Salem and he would fight at the legislative level. And he was the first African American district commander for the American Legion in the state of Oregon. And he led through that. He found places, and then he led from wherever he was. And when he got to be too popular and they would knock him down, he would start a new business or start something else. He never gave up, and he never showed any bitterness.
And this is in Oregon?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I mean, there's a lot going on in my head right now.
This is in LeGrand, Oregon. Mm-hmm. That's where I was born and raised. My mom, she's 95, and she still lives in the house I grew up in.
I'm sorry. Have you ever heard of Jack Johnson?
I have. Why do I know that name?
Well, you mentioned that your dad was a lightweight boxer.
Yeah.
And Jack Johnson is basically who your father seems to be. Defiant, persistent. He's a hero.
He is a hero. Mm-hmm. He's still a hero in many minds. And when I moved back here, because I wasn't born here, but this is where my family came to Oregon, is through Wallowa County up at Maxville. And because of his integrity and the way he worked and his willingness to be a liaison between the larger white community and the black community. If there was ever any issues, Lucky would help to mediate that. That started there, and it went on throughout his life in LeGrand. And he's gotten so many awards for the work that he does that when I moved here, I was just afraid that my neighbors were going to sell their houses, because that's how it was back in the day. You move in, and all of a sudden, for sale signs on either side of you. And I just was afraid, but I was going to have mine. I came and I bought my house, and I would only pack from the backyard. I wouldn't go out the front yard, and I'm taking boxes to the house. And this older lady next door, she went, "Hi," from across the fence. She was hanging her laundry, and "Welcome. I'm so glad to see you. Hey, are you related to Arthur Trice?" And, "Oh, he married my cousin, in the 60s. I'm like, "Oh my God, I moved next door to family." So it's like all these surprises, but people started knocking on my door and telling me welcome. Or I'd go to the hardware store, and they would just hug me. And I'd go to Safeway, and if you walk by a Safeway pharmacy, all the elders are there like, "Oh, excuse me, I got a story for you." So it's like 4 hours later, you're coming out of Safeway. So I ended up,
Are these white people?
all of them.
Why do you, what, that's, why do you think that is? Why do you think that there was this urgency to communicate with you? Where did that come from?
It comes from knowing my father. The elders knew him. And I've had people discount me. I've had at least one person I know that discounted openly and said, "She's lying, that never happened." And the old white sort of guard in the county said, "Well, no, I knew her father. He was a good man. He used to clean my coal furnace, and he was a logger up there, and he did this, and he's done that," and shut him down. And they just said, "Glad you're here to tell the story from your perspective."
I'm sorry. But why do you think his nickname was Lucky?
Yes.
Where did that come from?
They called him Lucky, and his license plate said Lucky T on it too, because he was good at gambling. He wasn't a drinker at all. So he'd come home with his winnings, and each kid would get some, and then mom would get some, and he kept his. And he was good at playing poker, and he loved it. And I remember one time he came home with a little cabin cruiser parked on the front of our lawn, and he'd take us out, the kids out in that. But that was what it is, and that's how we understand it now. Recently, I'd heard, and it's so interesting because people feel free now to tell me the truth in more ways than one. And they say, well, they call him Lucky because he's lucky he's alive.
So was that a name that he got here, from people in the community, or is that what you're saying?
The name Lucky came from him.
Oh, from him.
He generated that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then they kind of had their own interpretation of it.
Some did, because
Okay.
LeGrand was, the governor in the 20s came out of LeGrand. That was he became governor because of Klan money, and LeGrand had big Klan. All of this region did. They burned crosses on the adjoining hills of Maxville as a gentle reminder to stay where you need to be. And they had sundown laws early on all across Oregon. I mean, that's one of the components. Of course, when the town was closed, some of those people moved into Wallowa, the town of Wallowa. Our family, they moved to LeGrand right away. My grandmother, a lot of the women and children moved to LeGrand because they didn't have a segregated town. They had more black people living there. They had black churches. In fact, the church I went to, the Board Memorial Baptist Church, I didn't realize all the deacons were former loggers. So I've been steeped in my own history and didn't have any idea. And I needed to have a connection to a sense of place. It's every child should have that when you're a little kid and your teacher sets you away from your fellows when you're little, it's unacceptable. You need to be recognized for the work that generations before you did in your communities and others in the communities and recognize you in those positive ways. And that's, I was set aside from the beginning, and I just don't want that to happen if I can help it, and I can help it. I'm doing it every day. We're creating course curriculum, and we're doing everything that we can.
I'm just kind of like blown away by all of this. So I don't mean to sort of hijack anything. So please, like, if I've detoured anything, I couldn't hear about this story and not know more. Because like we're over here texting back and forth, like, what? It's just like, I'm sorry. So maybe at the end we'll come back to some of these other things.
Feel free to interject when questions come up, but yeah, we just talked about being set aside, and LeGrand having such a clan presence. But so what? To that end, I mean, well, can you just talk a little bit more? Like, what was it like growing up in the '60s in LeGrand?
We really never left our neighborhood. I don't remember leaving it very often. And of course, we lived on the other side of the tracks, right across the street from the tracks. And I remember when I was very little, like the hobos would come in on the trains during a certain time of the year. And we'd have these, I don't know, hobo races. But they'd race against the kids for money, and they'd do all these things. And of course, Mom would say, "Okay, all the girls get inside the fence. Let the boys play." And it was watchful, but it was like sick entertainment. That was one of the things that they did. We would go into the tall grass and make grass forts, and imagination. You used it a lot. I went to a grade school that was rural grade school, versus like across town was where the kids that had more influence went to school and lived. So I went to school with all the kids that had horses and stuff. So I got to ride my friends' horses, and I always wanted to own them. That was one of my dreams. To someday I'm gonna move to a log county, marry cowboy, live in a log home. Raise horses and dogs, have children, bite through the umbilical cord, bury the placenta under a tree. That's my 14-year-old dream. So I was very specific about what I wanted. But I really loved being with my rural friends because some of them, the ones that I got to stay with their families were so generous. But before I got to go anywhere, there was always the conversation. So I didn't have very many friends growing up because of that. Like some people would say, well, my mommy says I can't play with you because you're a nigger. And so or you could play with them, but you can't, don't bring them in the house kind of thing. Or there would be the conversation if they asked for me to spend the night, then the request would have to come from the parent, and then my parent would have to sit down and talk with theirs. And part of it was like just the assurance, I think, to make sure that if my child stays there, you know, it could affect, you know, how your neighbors see you, whatever that looks like. I was never told about the details of those conversations, but they happened every time, and I didn't always get to go. Even my 6th grade school teacher, she had Arabian horses, and she asked permissions, and I loved her. She treated me. She saw me. And my mom and I went out and spent the, you know, part of the day there, and so I got to spend the night, and I remember just how beautiful it was to be in that space and to just be fully seen. It's been, you know, that's been something that I just, when you're in a big house full of different kids, and it's different for some than others. And again, I was on a different track. I had most of my brothers were into sports. 2 of them were on their way to they were football heroes in town. They won the game balls for all in college. My brother Douglas, who passed away in 2020, he is in the Hall of Fame at his college and his high school. And my brother David played. He was a year younger, and I remember after the game, the last game David played. Of course, our team won, and the opposing team afterward started using the N-word, and a chase ensued. My brother was the passenger, and these people got to their home and pulled out high-powered rifles, shot through the car and into my brother. He survived it, but he's only 17. And I think in some ways it's changed his trajectory in many ways, you know. I'm so grateful that he's here with us. My sister was, you know, she's a veteran nurse now. She was also a cheerleader. So again, I went for Bruce Lee and karate instead. And backpacking and hiking and just really staying close to the land. I remember traveling with my dad when I was a little girl, and he would teach me how to look out of the traveling car and spot all the animals that I could spot. Because when you're little, you're like, I don't know what I'm seeing. And he would just help you train your eye and for movement and color and to really look closely. And I began to see skunks and deer and different animals in the woods. So that was really a big part of that growing up. And growing up too was processing animals. My dad had a walk-in meat locker built on the side of the house, so we always had elk or deer, a double freezer in the back. He was always going fishing and bringing back sturgeon or big containers of smelt that he'd dip. Or I remember coming home from grade school one day, and I went and was in the throne room sitting, and I look over into the tub, and it's like, about halfway full of Dungeness crab. And I'm like, Dad? And my mom looked at it, and she's like, ugh, Lafayette. She never called him Lucky. She always called him Lafayette by his proper name. So I remember those times, and I was talking with my mom. She just recently had a leg amputated about 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago, and I'm so grateful at 95 that she thrived. It was so fearful not knowing, and just seeing her now that her energy's back and she's sassy and lovely again and super strong. I've never seen her, well, I've seen her cry recently because of what's been going on, but she's been a rock in different ways. But just, I remember my mom used to have to clean, you know, the ducks, and I was about 5 years old, and she gave me this dead mallard, right? He's got the green head with the ring around it, and a paper bag, and she gives one to all the kids. She goes, "Go pluck this duck," and I'm like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. She goes, "I'll show you," and she goes outside, and we're sitting on the swing, and she just takes and just rips all these, and I'm like so traumatized, and I'm crying because I don't want to do this. So I'm like, feather by feather, pin feather, until it was clean all the way up to the little ring around his neck and his little tongue hanging out. And I was carrying him around. I'm like, baby. Aw. And finally, my mom comes back. She goes, "Where's the duck?" And I'm like, "I gave it to you." She goes, "No, you didn't. You're the only duck I don't have. Where's the duck?" And so she's getting angry. She can't find it anywhere. She's looked all over the house, looked outside. We go into my bedroom, or she goes in, and I'm already in there, and I'm playing around in the bedroom doing something, and she's tearing things apart, and I'm watching her, and she's just furious, and she gets ready to leave the room, and she turns around and looks at the bed, and I had put him under the covers, and the covers were up to the ring, and his head was on the pillow. So I haven't had to clean another duck since then, or pluck one anyway. But that's, those are the things. We'd get wakened to clean fish, or to make deer burger, or with the little ones would write the date and put them in the freezer. It was all this part of our sort of family energy, and we all knew that Dad was well respected. And for me, I thought we were rich because he was just so well respected in a town that was just, the energy's always been pretty dark. So I'm just trying to gather, because as I got older, I realized it was going to be hard to get a job in LeGrand as a black person. And so, I graduated at 17, and I moved into one of my grandmother's houses, and my dad sent for her mom, and sent for her sister and brother, and all of those. They lived next door. And so there was that connection. And then church was not very far away. Our pastor would come around from Walla Walla, Pasco, Tri-Cities, Hermiston, and then back to LeGrand. And we had these same churches built by the same builder, too. So I would like to see those on Historic Register. I've already made the suggestion, and I'm talking with people that are working on that. So I do remember that well, but I remember too that a lot of them were elder as I became an older kid, and just sitting and listening to them sing. There was no Sunday school, so I talked Mom into letting me go to the White Baptist Church across the street because they had Sunday school, and I would be with other kids, and so that was helpful in introducing me to a church camp I used to go to called Camp Elkanah, and it still exists today, and it's a logging camp, and we used to stay in the camp cars. And I thought, someday I'm gonna live in one of these as I'm sitting on it. And I just love that space. I've tried to buy some of their cars before, and I got close, and glad we didn't do it because our purchase now is so much more significant to our own work. But what I loved about going to that camp was I got to be next to the land again. I got to hike and be in those spaces and meet other kids, and just that energy of all of it together. Kind of a long answer. I could go on.
I guess just to transition a little bit to kind of the work at Maxwell Heritage Center, did you know a lot about logging and the timber industry before you started really digging into this research?
No, I really didn't. I knew the Paul Bunyan story, and that's about it. I've always lived near, LeGrand's a timber town, and Boise Cascade has been very strong there for many years, and they'd go up and then they'd die out, and they'd go up and they'd die out, and people would get injured, and all kinds of things that way. The sort of the manufacturing of cutting wood, but nothing about the industry at all. Because yeah, I had nothing to tie me to it, except for I had something inside of me that was attracted to it. I certainly like to backpack and be near the land and be in the woods. I just didn't know what it meant for me.
And what would you say is like the most fascinating thing you've learned about logging since starting this work?
My dad's a logger. My dad was an experienced logger, and so was his father. That they were recruited to Oregon when the laws were on the books that excluded us from living, working, owning land. That's a proud moment to me, that regardless of the law, he brought his family out to Oregon. I don't know that they knew anything about the exclusion laws, because a lot of people think we're going out to Oregon because it's got all of these wonderful things. I mean, there was a point that, unless you had papers of ownership, free black people weren't really able to travel on the Oregon Trail. So, and again, I didn't find any of that out until later. I just had no idea. To me, that healed me to find out that I'm here because I am supposed to be, and I'm meant to be here as much as anybody else on this space. A lot of people want to lay claim to the space, and truly, there were people here for 9,000 years before us that were the first and that were pushed out of the land. And, it's important to stewardship the land and the water and the wildlife, and to have a better understanding of it. And, that speaks to me because that's how my father was. I know that I'd heard many stories that he used to net fish with the tribes, and he and his brother would fish with them, and that he just lived his life incorporating a lot of the beliefs, especially around animals and respect, and not to, if you shoot it, you eat it. I remember my little brother Danny was on this shooting spree with his BB gun when he was little. He was shooting sparrows, and Dad said, so he'd be plucking a sparrow, and he'd go and cook it. Okay, that's good. And he'd shoot another kind of bird, pluck it, and cook it out and eat it. And then he did one of those to a mud hen. And they're just, they dig to the bottom of ponds and stuff, and they taste just like mud. So I think that was his last bird experience, was trying to feast off of a mud hen. But, yeah.
Well, so thinking about, so why did you start this like center? You have the Maxville, Interpretive Heritage Center.
So originally, when I found out the history and I started collecting stories of the elders, that became my first goal. I'd gotten my degree, and I really was getting that pull to be here instead of being in the city. And I found out stories that I began to write a screenplay about, and it was very upsetting to write it, and I don't know that I can talk much about it because it's still in progress, but it's a disturbing story, and I wanted it to be a story of redemption for the town of Maxville, for all the people in that small community. And every time I'd go to the producer I was working with to talk about, how to set up the screenplay, how to put it all together, I finally realized that it was time to go home. I couldn't write it from the city. That I'm like, I'm gonna sell my house and I'm gonna move to Loudoun County and I'm gonna write my screenplay. And then I'm gonna reach out to Morgan Freeman. I've got a couple other folks because I've had someone else write a musical play called Onto Higher Ground about the black loggers that came. And we're getting that shopped around. But this was, at the beginning, it was really gnawing at me, and this whole story just really pulled me. I like to equate it with the salmon coming back to the stream that they were spawned in, or that they have to come back to spawn, that, where they were eggs. And I just felt compelled to be back here. So that was my first inclination. And so I started doing interviews of all the elders, because most of my interviews are people that are in their 90s or their very late 80s, but mostly mid to late 90s. And I traveled to Texas to get the last living logger at the time that was in Maxville, and all over Oregon, in different places had searched. And as I began to put this together, somebody contacted me and said, I'm gonna connect you with, I have a friend at OPB. They'd be interested in doing your story. I went, really? And I went, okay, well, I put all of this stuff together because I really was trying to figure it all out. And I put it all on the table, and everybody at, their executive director, everybody was at the table. And I sat there and I told them the story, and I'm weeping and I'm talking all of this, and they just had tears standing in their eyes, and they just were like, we have to do this story. So that's really what catapulted, and that's how The Logger's Daughter on OPB came about in 2009. Yeah. And so
Did Steve Amon do that?
this was Eric Kane.
Eric Kane.
Mm-hmm.
We both worked at OPB for a time.
Oh.
I was there in 2009, and nobody even talked to me about it.
Shoot.
I mean, I was the only black person in that studio at the time, and the fact that this is all new to me is like upsetting in a lot of different ways. Like, I've never heard your story before, and I worked at that organization. I don't know, I'm having all kinds of feelings back here.
I know.
But I don't, and again, I'm having to leave.
It is
like,
so, no.
There's a lot going
No,
on.
but this is part of the transition, because I really wanted to do this, and I'd started thinking about, how do I do this? I was laid off from Boeing. I'd finished school, and now I have to start over. And I figured, let me start over where I want to be, and then I can create the who, and the how. And once The Logger's Daughter came to the county, I had it shown at the senior center in Wallowa, and I was putting all these chairs in. I said, I need as many. I'm like, what's your capacity? 230. I'm like, I need 230 chairs in here. We're gonna fill this space. And I made the guy mad. I mean, I'd rented the space, but the guy who was like the fella in charge, he's like, you're not gonna need all those chairs. And he would call the school and say, don't give her any more. And he just kept pushing back, and I said, like, you know what? I've rented this space, and I can outweigh you. So, you can go home now. And I'll tell you what, we had the chairs filled in standing room in back. And there were people from family members that one woman gave a cousin of mine a bus ticket from Portland. And after watching it, he came up and he has his cane and a bouquet of flowers. And he came up and he wept. He says, you know, I'm the first black child born at Enterprise Hospital. And I'm so proud of you, Gwen. And it just became no longer about me. It became about all of us. And I knew that I couldn't keep the story to myself, that it has to be a place for healing. A lot of the elder white men were in front with their walkers and chairs, and their late adult children were standing behind them, just flabbergasted. They didn't get it. Why are you crying? And I knew him. They'd look up from their chairs and they'd look at me, and I'm bringing back memory. I'm sparking all of these things that happened. And it became clear that this needed to be more. And I needed to have this Maxfield project become more. So then I started going to the local economic district. I started being involved in leadership training within the county and community building, so people could see me, see who I am, see what I'm made out of. I could see who's doing what and who to play with, and then we got that 501c3 started from that, and so my screenplays are on hold because there's no life at risk here. I can, it's so important to get this thing established in a way to where the baby's not only walking, but the baby's no longer a baby. This is a full-grown movement and opportunity for education and for celebration and discovery, quiet contemplation, stimulating conversations, healing, trauma. And trauma happens to all of us so deep, DNA deep, that that's for me is when I had to make the shift. I knew I was in the right place. I just didn't know in what order things were happening.
I feel like you kind of alluded to a little bit of this in just that answer, but what do you think your legacy will be, and what would you like the legacy of the Maxwell Heritage Center to be? I'm sorry.
The legacy of Maxville is healing and hope. Education, lifting up the next generations for however many hundreds of years that we can continue to have people of color help to drive it, and that it doesn't get homogenized, that we keep and encourage the exchange of our past, and interweave it with a long relationship, a lifelong, a generations long relationship with our indigenous people in this area, that we get to learn from it, that we get to go there and look at the dark skies, look up, and understand that our people have used, in fact, every culture in the world has used the stars for guidance for many things, what to get away, for crops, for navigation, all of these things. It's been a really integral part of life on the planet. So we want to offer simple things in deep ways that can be passed on over and over again to bring people who are not who aren't comfortable being in the woods and let them know you belong here too. This is for you. And this is for you. And these are for your kids. And this is your brave space. And to hear the voices that are coming up, because concepts around certain things change, but the baseline shouldn't. But as young people come, as the world becomes different, we need to be able to be flexible for the difference that happens while keeping the integrity of the space and the energy, the heart of that. Very simple.
I had a question about just kind of thinking about the indigenous communities here, and like kind of talking about your father's kind of relationship, and so one, who are the indigenous communities like from this region, and just as you were talking about like stewardship and and also too, I feel like when you think about Oregon and just the logging, like what comes to mind for a lot of people is like white people and like white cultures. But just thinking about the indigenous communities here, also thinking about your family coming from where you came from, and also like also Black people as being indigenous to somewhere who were displaced, so us as indigenous, could you kind of like speak to that relationship with the indigenous communities and also with the land in any way?
So I made a trip to Lapawai, Idaho, to Nez Perce country. They were here, and they're coming back, buying their land back, which is hard to fathom, having to buy back land that you have been pushed off of. But I went down and I had a conversation. Actually, I arranged and I asked if I can speak with the tribal council. And I brought my story to them, and I also brought this folder. Actually left it in my car, but the folder, I wanted to show, first of all, my connection to the tribe's work and to my father. And it was when they had done the Looking Glass fish hatchery, all the work that had gone into that, and I believe it was the early 80s, and that's when at least he got the award for the state for that. And it had one of the former chief, he's not former chief, he passed, and then my dad had passed. But I said, this is some of the work that my dad has done in La Grande for conservation, his love for the land, his love for the indigenous people and his relationships. And so I passed that around. And then I passed around another document to talk about me and who I am. And I said, I want to come from you, from a Black person to a brown person, without the dominant culture in between us. And I want to tell you my dream and my story. And I want to work with you side by side. I want to understand this land that we're going to be stewards of. And I want to hear it from you first, because you were here first and you had sustainability practices that worked. And I want to get my data from everyone, but I want to begin at the beginning. And I said several other things in that conversation, but once I got a chance to speak, and they got a chance to read through everything. They finally began to speak and show their appreciation for me being there, that they wanted me to keep them posted, that they really liked what I was doing. One of the elders said, you know, I went to college in LeGrand for a long time, and I didn't know anything about your dad and all the good work that he's done. You must be very proud. And that, you know, it just helps me know that I embody him by what I do. And the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla is another group that I've been working with for many years, and they've supported our museum, and I've asked that group of Confederated Umatilla, sorry, friends, if for that same support, and I got agreement on both ends. They had different maps that were old maps that would show a route where Maxville was and what it was used for, what it looked like, what was the interpretation in the native language. So we want to set up not just interpretation in English, but in native. And we want to understand what plants might be at risk, what plants might be harvestable by the tribes, what kinds of long-term relationships can we have to hire for consultation. And we just got a 3-year grant to support that effort with the tribe specifically. And so we are building on that right this minute to have their foresters come to our land and help us be. And I say it's ours, but it's, you know, we're stewards of this space. And I don't own it. The organization is the steward, and I am such a loving change maker in the space, pushing for this. And it's after this many years, it's happening.
That's so powerful. That's so deep.
Makes my heart beat so hard.
Yeah, that's so deep. Thank you.
So, yeah, just had a couple more questions, just 'cause we're running a little bit long, but one, just, you mentioned working with the youth and specifically BIPOC youth earlier. Can you just talk about, one, just the importance of that with what you're trying to do, and just, you know, I guess like, just like what feelings come to you, like specifically when young people come through this space?
Well,
And to them, how do they feel?
right. Well, and that's the thing is I get to meet him for the first time tomorrow night. So and they're going to be doing podcasts while this is happening. And so it'll be interesting. Everyone's voice informs. And what I'm doing is showing basically the history, and I'm building the future. I'm building the present and the future for all of us. And I would like to ask, you know, how do you see it? How would you like to see it? What's drawing you? What part of the land is drawing you? You know, and is it the sandhill cranes and the eagles flying overhead? Is it the wild turkeys gobbling through the land? Is it the elk and deer, you know, running through it? What is it? And a lot of students, and I have to say this about, it's not, you know, people see this as a black organization. We're black led for sure, but this is really lifting up the voices of everyone that has been in this industry. And there have been Greek loggers at Maxville, there are Filipino loggers, Romanian, Chinese, Japanese. There's so many loggers, and those are just the ones I know of. in Oregon. And I just met a woman last weekend whose dad was a logger in the old days in Eugene. And so we're going to get her up here for our gathering and to really make that connection. But a lot of people of color, a lot of kids of color just don't set their feet on in the woods. And it makes them uncomfortable, and it makes people, black people especially, we're taught to fear rural Oregon. Stay out of there. I'm not going there. And some parts of rural are more frightening than others. I feel grateful where I live. But it's also about building your muscle tone and your strength as an individual on what makes you and what you can do. I mean, and once you let go of one part of your life, because I've lived in the city for 30 years. I loved it for a period of time. But my heart belongs where the trees are and the water is and the wildlife is close. Not too close in some instances, because we've got some pretty intense wildlife from time to time, but then so do the cities. So I feel like this is definitely where my essence is, and I think that if we can show these students alternate ways to approach and enter in, that is helpful for us to see how, first of all, people react, how people are feeling about it. It's going to be a little bit more difficult with the younger students, but I met a woman at a conference this weekend, and she goes, I've been trying to get a hold of you. I'm going to bring about 7 kids to you to Maxville, and they're all going to be, middle schoolers, and I said, well, now we don't have any facilities set up out there yet. She goes, I'm bringing the RV, and I want you to show us Maxville. They need to see you. They need you. And see what they do, and be prepared with conversations and activities that stimulate their mind, that stimulate their artist's creative self too. I believe that's another way to get in, is not only through the science, but through art. And wherever you reside, unless you're straight on artist, I think it's important to do creative work. And we have a project right now called the Album Project that we're putting together, that we're encouraging young students of color and indigenous to write poetry, spoken words, essays, maybe do artwork. So on the artwork will be indigenous and African American art, and the music will come from the poetry and the essays. We're going to team them. We're going to put that writings with a professional musician, and we're going to add to that the music of us, which is a lot of blues back in the day. And we're going to create this album with the indigenous students, and I was headed right into a class, I think the week that the pandemic shut down the school, so I haven't had a chance to go back, but a lot of the indigenous students that I've met are very interested in rap, but to do drumming and to do whatever that is filling their heart and spirit, to add that in a really positive way. Give them not only their name credit, but compensate them and show them, we're not just doing this to take from you. This is yours, and it's got your credit to it. It's your work. And to then have at least 500 copies that go to the libraries and the schools around the state for free. So that's another way we want to get the kids sort of plugged in. We've got several people that we're working with, and we're looking right now for an education program manager to help build this more readily, because we're going to have a whole nother space with all these different types of programs in it. And I want to have that position filled by someone with a learned experience so that we can move the work forward in that way. Yeah.
I heard a black farmer once say that black people think that the land is the scene of a crime, or she thinks that like the land is the scene of the crime, but not the crime itself. I think is what her
Oh.
wording was, and I wonder what you have learned from your relationship living out here on the land that you would want black people who have lost that connection to know.
I mean, we really, I approach this in a really holistic way, and it just affects different people in so many different ways. In the unwinding of that learned bias, it releases in different ways. So I don't know how it's going to affect each one, and not everybody's gonna love it, right? And that's a thing that you have to accept. And so I feel like with all of the joyful things, it's the ones that aren't savvy with it. And I've had some students here. They're like, "Oh, there's bugs," and they were like no-see-ums. They were like, "You'll find those in the city too." And like you're in a park right now. You're not even in you're not even away yet. So I don't know how to answer that. For me, it's because I started here. It's been a part of me, but then the scene of the crime, right, was the influence of bias and hatred. And the way I was taught to deal with it, I'm really grateful for. I think if I were raised in the South, I wouldn't be around for very long. I don't know. I've always lived in the Pacific Northwest in some way, but I have this upbringing that's basically, I didn't see any black kids in any of my classes ever until I went to college outside of here. So I think my answer would be limited in that way. I'm not sure how to answer it.
Is there anything that we didn't ask you about that you want to share with us before we wrap?
Oh, there's so much. I don't think so, because we're going to have more time to talk on the way up.
When we do go up, can I ride with you in the car with the camera? Or are we all gonna get in the same van?
I thought I was gonna ride to
Okay, no
the
problem.
bottom of the hill
Okay,
and then park it, because I won't take my car up there.
okay.
I have a pickup truck. I can go and get that instead. It's funky though. I'm just saying.
So is it, in terms of the territory to get up there, will that car get up there? Will that be okay?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, easy.
Okay. Okay.
I just won't take
No, I'm fine. I'm
the
fine.
little. Oh, look at how pretty.
Yeah, it does look great. So what I would love to do now, do we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless you got
No, I'm
First of all, like, I'm over here losing my back here. Like, I'm sorry if I was distracted, but like, I just want to say thank you, like, just for just being here and doing this, because I don't know even what happened to me, but it all just sort of clicked that I think that you as a person are like a incredibly important, and I
Yeah, it's true, because
And I've never met someone so connected to all of this. Like, we're talking all the way out here, like who's out here? And I didn't know. I feel awful for not knowing. And that's, I mean, this is me, and I didn't know. And I'm trying to. I mean, I've lived in Oregon. I was born in Oregon all my life, and I've been trying to get out of here because I didn't know. I didn't think that I was here. I've never been out here before, so that's one thing. Thank you. And I know it probably hasn't been easy. But
I think the hard part sometimes for me is now here, people are used to me and I'm not so much in some ways. Others are like, when we're so proud of you. And then I've started doing Black leadership meetings, and I always get excited. I'm like, they look like me. I will learn something. I will, have like camaraderie. And the fact is, I'm still set aside sometimes, and that's
gonna stop now.
And it's just hard. So just to see all your faces in here makes me crazy.
I don't know what to say. I feel bad. I didn't know. It makes me angry that in 2009 I was sitting there. I didn't know.
Shame on them for not sharing this with you.
Besides, no, I just didn't. And I've been looking for it. I've been looking for your story. I've been looking for you. I didn't know, and I've heard your name bandied about, but I didn't know I was even caught up in all the stuff that I was doing or everybody. I didn't know.
I'm glad that we've met each other. I have to figure out, we need somebody to take our picture together somehow, because I just want to, I just don't want this to end kind of,
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about from here. I don't know what happens, but I got a lot of stuff going on right now. But I think I sense a shift in priorities. And there's a lot to talk about.
okay.
So for now, though, yeah, I want to photograph a lot
Okay.
in here, just so.